listening to the Discovery Pod, a podcast dedicated to conversations with leaders in the social profit sector. Discover the origin stories of CEOs, founders, and other senior leaders and learn from them so you can accomplish what is most important. Now, on with the show with your host, Douglas Nelson.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Discovery Pod, Conversations with Social Profit Leaders. Today on the show, we have a very special guest, someone that I've been hoping to get on the podcast since we launched, Shoshana Ungerleider. She's a physician, a board member, a speaker, a founder, and a palliative care activist. She is the executive producer of the Oscar-nominated documentary Endgame, and we're really pleased to have her here on the Discovery Pod today. Shoshana, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I felt tired just reading that list out of all of the things that you're involved in. Tell us how you got your plate so full and what keeps you going these days.
Oh my goodness, I know. Sometimes when I hear it, I'm like, who are they talking about? That's not me. Yeah, it's somewhat by accident. I found myself spending a whole lot of my early 30s training in medicine. So that takes, 80 to 100 hours a week of your time. You're hyper-focused. And I really liked that. But also by the end of 3 years of residency was really burned out. And so asked myself, what am I most passionate about in life? And that was making sure that my patients and their families knew more about how to make sure that their end of life experience was in line with their goals and their values. And so thought through, how can we best rethink medical education so all doctors and other clinicians know how to talk to their patients about hard stuff, because it turns out we're not teaching them how to do this stuff. And then how can we engage the consumers of healthcare? So patients, families, really all of us in what the options are and how to best ask for what they want and really deserve. And so, it turned out that initially it was through philanthropy and then a bunch of film projects. It fell in my lap and many other things. So it's been an interesting last 5 years. Never in a million years would I have imagined I would end up on this path, but it's been really just incredible. And I've learned so much so far.
Well, I want to go back there. You said that you thinking about where you get your energy, where your passion lies, and having those conversations, those end-of-life conversations with patients. Was there a particular moment, a particular conversation that really sparked that for you?
Gosh, there probably wasn't one conversation, but I would say that pretty early on in my residency, my internal medicine residency, I was spending months and months in the ICU doing normal training. And I was just really struck by the number of older, more frail adults who were being admitted to the hospital and then ending up in our ICU where the most aggressive invasive care gets provided. And these were folks that had widely metastatic cancer or end-stage organ disease. And they were ending up on what I realized is this default pathway wherein, at least in the United States, you will receive aggressive invasive care no matter how old you are and no matter how sick you are. And even if it won't help you, unless you opt out pretty loudly or have somebody there in your corner advocating that, oh, mom, dad, brother, you didn't want this. Let's talk about what the other options are. And so once I realized that was the case, and many of these folks were spending their final days, weeks, minutes of life hidden away from the people they love and sometimes in significant amounts of pain, it didn't sit well with me. That's not why I went into medicine. And I wanted to make sure that more people and their families had information and that we started conversations really, really far upstream, like months and even years upstream, what I would consider to be an acute crisis, so that we could best deliver care that's, again, in line with people's goals and their values, and it's care that they want, and at least they understand what's going on, because there's often a very big disconnect between what's happening in a very busy hospital and what patients and families are sort of gathering as to what's happening. And we really need to be closing that gap and educating physicians, nurses, other providers of healthcare about how to best talk about hard things like prognosis, like what are the goals of care here? What does the future hold for somebody when they're very, very ill or have a life-limiting illness? I was really lucky to be trained by palliative care doctors who know how to do those things and use a team-based approach to caring for people and not just look at the medical, but also look at the spiritual and the psychological, and really more about what life is like. So how to look at illness in the context of the whole picture of someone's life and come up with a plan to care for them that focuses on having them live their best day every day, no matter how many days they have left.
I was really struck by looking at what you've got on NWell and as was part of the documentary as well, the phrase, we help people live as well as possible for as long as possible, which is sounds relatively straightforward on one reading, but is also a really profound change in what typically people expect to see from a physician in a hospital.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, I would say that I wish all of medicine would take that on as kind of the ethos, that we should be asking people what matters most to them in their lives and then tailoring all care based on the answers to that question. Because whether we're talking about managing diabetes or high blood pressure in a younger person, or we're talking about end of life decisions, to me, it should be framed around what matters to people and what does a good day look like today and maybe next week and maybe next year, and really engage more people in that way around their own lives and their own care. So it really is, the field of palliative care has taught me so much about, how to think about life, how to think about death. And at the end of the day, it's all about, no matter how old you are, it's about living as well as possible for as long as possible.
That's absolutely right. What gets in the way of physicians being able to provide that care across the spectrum of healthcare?
Oh my goodness, so many things. The big things that stand out for me sort of on the societal level is that we still have a huge cultural, societal stigma around talking about death and dying. So maybe about 100 years ago and before, people would die in their own homes. We didn't have modern medicine, modern technology to care for people in hospitals. That idea didn't even exist. And so most people literally died on their dining room table, surrounded by, family and others. And so death was something that was expected and planned for and was part of day-to-day life. And somewhere around 50 years ago, that really transitioned to death being hidden away in hospitals and other institutions. A lot of good things came along with that, in that we can save lives now and we've extended life expectancy. But what that's done for having a day-to-day awareness of our own mortality, things that has really shifted. So I think that's number one. I think number two, because of that, doctors now see death as a failure. And we do everything we can to avoid failure in medicine. And we don't see, and we're not taught how to have a role in healing when cure is no longer possible. For many physicians, that's seen as not my job. If I can't cure this person of this illness, why would I be involved? And I think that's the wrong way to see it, because we're always caring for our patients, whether a cure is the intent or not. And then I think, thirdly, at least I can speak to the U.S. healthcare system, and I think there's some parallels in Canada and the U.K., although not directly, in that, we have a lot of perverse incentives in medicine. We're paid to do things to people, like surgeries, procedures. That is how the health insurance system is set up. And on the flip side, we're really not reimbursed or paid to sit and talk with people. And even though I've seen 3-hour conversations from a palliative care provider with patients and families really change someone's life dramatically, just as much as an open heart surgery would in some respects. It's not valued in our medical culture and therefore not taught. So I love to make the comparison that most surgeons spend somewhere between 6, 7, 9, 10, sometimes years training in the operating room to learn technical skills, right? It's so technical. Whereas we know that 70% of doctors have not been trained in how to have difficult conversations with patients. And that to me is such an essential skill of being any kind of doctor, not just a palliative care doctor. And so to me, we've really missed the mark in terms of medical education. And I think that's slowly changing. And a lot of the work that we're doing, Sutter and with NWell, is changing that a bit. But, it'd be nice to see at the highest level of graduate medical education, that be a top priority, because it's, we have 10,000 baby boomers turning 65 every day in America. This issue is only going to get, bigger. And so I think the time was yesterday to start thinking about this.
Well, and looking back, you described some of your personal journey there, but training as a physician, you've also, through your own philanthropy, done a lot to encourage that kind of education of in postgraduate medicine through your work with NWell, which is really a movement to change the way both the healthcare system and individuals think about the end of life. You're encouraging this conversation to think about it in a different way. How have you found people's response to that within the hospital and outside?
It's been quite positive, surprisingly. I sort of thought building something new, at least creating a media platform and a convening that was so interdisciplinary beyond just the typical healthcare system, I thought people would be less receptive to it. And honestly, it's been really positive. People like getting to work with entrepreneurs and venture capital and policy folks and patients and caregivers, people who are often forgotten in this conversation, designers, the media, educators, because really, I mean, this is truly a human issue. You know, the end of life is, to me, not a medical issue to be solved, but rather something that all human beings should be thinking about, reflecting on personally, and then sort of talking about in their own lives. And it's been wonderful to actually see the response. It's in just 2.5 years of being in existence, we've grown exponentially month over month, and we're just excited for the future.
And understandably so. You said you've been warmly received, or people have been very open to that. Has it been the same with your physician colleagues who are open to that idea that the end of life is something to be understood but not solved?
I mean, I think so. And maybe it's just because I live in kind of an innovation bubble in San Francisco. But I would say for the most part, I think especially younger physicians who have come up in an era of having a little more understanding of the importance of palliative care, of talking early and often with our patients about what matters most to them, meaning the sort of the advanced care planning conversation about healthcare preferences. I think that there's a new day of medicine coming with people who are both clinically trained as well as sort of more culturally savvy in terms of why this is an important conversation to be having. So yeah, it's been surprising to me as well, but many, many people are excited by this and energized by the fact this is not just a healthcare problem to be solved, but rather there are more people invested in this conversation to come up with the right solutions going forward.
How about families or patients or families or people that are encountering these end-of-life conversations in their own life? Much feedback from them, either in terms of the documentary or the work you're doing with NWell?
Yeah, I think most people agree that this is a very hard subject, right? And anybody who says it's not, it's crazy. This is, no matter if you talk about this stuff all day long, every day or not, this is really tough stuff. There are a lot of existential questions that come up when we deal with the subject matter. And so I think that, the goal with the documentary film Endgame and the one before it, Extremis, was to really shine a light in some of these dark places where we feel like opening up this conversation, or at least opening the door, even a crack to this conversation, is really, really important. Because again, this is a topic that is largely hidden away, and most families, aren't going to sit around the dinner table and talk about every night, and they shouldn't. This is something that, maybe once a year people can talk about with the people that they love, because, at the end of the day, we don't know what tomorrow will bring. And the more that we can be kind of prepared and in a mind space so that, everybody can get care that they want at the end of their lives is really critical. So I would say that, overall the response has been wonderful. And when we went to the Oscars this year with the film, we were stopped on the street. People recognized BJ Miller and said, "Oh my goodness, I saw your short documentary. It was so impactful for me." So that's the kind of feedback that we don't always get unless you're kind of out in the world showing the film and talking about it. And it's been really wonderful and energizing for me to get that feedback from people.
Right. And one of the big tenets of the work that you're doing is using design thinking, design theory to change the conversation, to change the way healthcare is working. How have you used that design thinking? And because it's a new way of thinking, is it opening up people's willingness to consider changing the system? This is a new way to do things? That's
a great question. I got exposed to design thinking sort of later on in my educational journey, really after my medical training, when I, with you, got to do a project with the design firm that's worldwide, but based in San Francisco. And really, in the most simple, straightforward way, I think it makes sense to me, at least, that, when you are creating a new product, a new service, a new system, keeping the end user at the center of that conversation, whether it's you're designing something for a patient, for a caregiver, for a clinician, you make sure that those people are at the table when coming up with those ideas and then testing them. And so that to me is just, common sense, right? And that essentially, in a very boiled down way, is one of the main tenets of design thinking. So we said, what if we are to create an entire symposium that keeps that framework at its core, which is why we went to designers and entrepreneurs and funders and patients and caregivers and lawyers and healthcare providers, say, hey, let's all come together, listen to some experts, and then see how we can collaborate and build new things together. And it's been really exciting to see what's come of that event and thinking differently about problem solving.
Now, anyone who's listening to this can probably tell what I've known for a number of years, which is you're a very difficult person to say no to, and your enthusiasm and your drive really inspires people to want to be a part of the movement that you have in many ways single-handedly launched. How have you, when you've encountered barriers and you've encountered people that want to close the door, that don't want this movement to move forward, how have you either worked through them or around them?
Oh man, good question. This is going to sound really weird, but I so rarely encounter people who are not interested in this. And maybe I just select for them in my life, but I definitely think everybody has a story, right? And what we've learned with showing this film across the country, in hundreds and hundreds of venues, what we've learned from the followers of Endwell on social media, through our website, at our symposium, is everybody is impacted by serious illness and death and dying and grief and loss and the issues around caregiving. This is part of what it means to be a human being. And as challenging and heart-wrenching as it can be sometimes, this is truly at its core the great kind of equalizer. And so I think when we can appeal, or when I can appeal to that side of people or that part of people's lives, they get it. Because, whether you've encountered it personally in your own family or tangentially through a close friend or extended family, it's there. And if we're not already patients in the healthcare system, we will be at some point. So this is something that is really just quite universal. And so I often those issues just come up in conversation. And so I rarely meet anybody who says, well, this is not important. Why are you doing this? Everybody gets it.
They may be trying to avoid you because they want to avoid the conversation in general. But so you mentioned a couple of times that Endwell has really grown quite a bit over the last 2.5 years. Where have you found the energy, the new ideas to keep this movement growing as quickly as it has been?
Well, what we learned with year one, when this was really an experiment of bringing a very diverse group of people together, both on stage and in the audience, was that we sold out 3 months in advance. So we were shocked that there was so much interest. So we said, how can we expand this network even further and invite even more diverse group of people to this conversation? Because really, there isn't anybody. When people ask me, who's your audience? Who isn't the audience is often my response, just given the universal nature of the subject matter. And so we've continued to think really broadly in terms of, how can we use people's personal narratives, their personal experience, both personal and professional, to shed light on various elements of this conversation. So we've had folks like Kai-Fu Lee, one of the founders of artificial intelligence, who was at Microsoft and at Google China, talk about his experience of being somebody who relied heavily on technology to solve problems, but realized when he himself became ill, seriously ill, that there was no robot or no artificial intelligence code that could replace a human being, and how important that is to keep involved in the conversation. We've had folks like the co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, who, Alicia Garza, own mother, spent a lot of time in hospice before her end of life, before she died. And speaking about, how as somebody who has built a movement over time, how important that it is that it's not just a hashtag, that people are out there doing and out there experiencing to create change. And so Yeah, I mean, I think we're continuing to think really broadly about what is possible in terms of this conversation. And I think people are excited by that. We're always looking for the unexpected, the new and different topic, as well as highlighting people that have been working in the space for decades and have really moved the needle forward in terms of the policy and the healthcare systems design and the patient advocacy work. So it really takes all of us.
I love that idea of thinking as broadly as possible, bringing along as many people as possible. It's one of the things we see with our work here at the Discovery Group with clients is the clients that are really operating at that exceptional level of organizational performance have a lot of traits in common. But first and foremost is a broad openness to new ideas and really taking the big picture view of whatever their mission is. And big picture view allows them to respond to challenges and take advantages of new opportunities. And it sounds like that's exactly what you're doing with Endwell.
That's what we're trying to do, at least. We're a lean team. We operate like a startup. And at this point, we're obviously a nonprofit. But I think because this field, this conversation is changing so rapidly in the United States and beyond, that we have to be open to new ideas, to new concepts, to thinking, how can we most effectively change the world? So for me, as somebody who's trained in medicine, it's been a really exciting ride so far, and I'm learning new things every day.
So as you're learning these new things, who do you look to or who do you talk to when you have a question that you're struggling with as leader of this movement, of leader of Endwell? Who do you look to for advice?
Well, we have a fantastic advisory board who is a mixture of hospice and palliative care content folks on the healthcare side, on the policy side, on the design side, on the media front. A lot of how we're thinking about not only curating, producing a wonderful event every December in San Francisco is how do we then disseminate that information? So leveraging traditional media, social media, technology platforms to make sure that all of these incredible talks get out there to the world, because that's really our goal, is to foster new conversations to affect culture change through opening up people's minds to this conversation, even people who don't even work in the space of healthcare and beyond. I mean, I think, again, this is part of what it means to be a human being, is to recognize our own, mortality, that one day life will end, and how can we live our best day every day. So it's teaching myself how to, our first month of Endwell, to build a website and use social media. I mean, there's so many people that have helped us out along the way and that I go to for advice. And sometimes it's my friends' kids who are teenagers who are like, wait, you got to use Instagram, or, have you thought about using Snapchat to push out your content? So it's, again, every single day, learning new things, thinking differently about how to solve problems. So it keeps me on my toes.
Well, with that kind of energy and with the momentum behind you, you mentioned you're built like a startup at Endwell. Do you see it as a tension about wanting to stay that lean and mean, and then the other side of that tension is becoming more of an institution or a more formal organization may in some ways be more sustainable over time? How do you balance those two off one another?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we're at this point reaching some growing pains around that discussion at about almost the 3-year mark or 2.5-year mark of existence. And so I think it's something that's really important to think about as we continue to grow and want to scale up. Am I the right person to be running this organization? And sometimes that's a hard conversation even to reflect on, just given that this is my baby. And, I've with partners, of course, have grown it from something teeny tiny to something, that's more kind of internationally known as an entity. And so I think that is a tension and something that every organization should be thinking a lot about, and sustainability for the future, given that we know we're largely philanthropy funded. And those things can fluctuate, over time, the availability of philanthropic dollars and beyond. And so I think that we are at an interesting point in our growth around that conversation. So it's definitely important for people to be thinking about as they grow from the early stage to a larger, more established entity.
Yeah, it is. We see a lot of organizations struggling with that transition, and organizations that haven't had the same initial success that you've had. But those are really important and really difficult conversations to have about what the future of the organization might be. I want to go back to one thing that you touched on earlier about leveraging philanthropy. So being primarily funded by donor dollars. And you said leveraging philanthropy to spark innovation and to really change the story. And that's what I think most donors, particularly people who are giving significant gifts to any organization, they want to spark innovation. They want to spark a change. How do you view that, both as a donor and now as a recipient, as leader of NWELL?
I think for us, it's not a very hard sell in terms of doing something that's highly innovative that has really taken off over the last couple of years. So I have had that experience that there are many small family foundations up to much larger philanthropic organizations that see culture change specifically as something that's really hard to wrap your brain around and to measure, but that you can't argue with the fact that our viewership on, for example, Facebook, we've reached 11 million people with our last video that went viral. I mean, things like that in terms of the surrogate numbers that you can use to measure kind of uptake and culture change can be really powerful. Similarly with the film project, Netflix bought Endgame. We have no idea how many people have seen it, where they live, how old they are. We literally have no data, but we were nominated for an Academy Award. So that's an interesting surrogate marker of impact. So I think a lot of people, when we think about sparking innovation, want to make sure that, those dollars are going to a worthwhile place and that there's a way to measure success over time. So I think that's really important, but it's also really hard, especially when you're looking at something as kind of nebulous as culture change. So I would say for me as a philanthropist, I'm always thinking about what problem are we trying to solve here? X amount of money get us to the next level in terms of moving the needle. But again, these are sometimes can be hard things to measure. So I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Well, changing the way our culture thinks about the end of life is difficult to put into a few ROI statistics at the bottom of the page, but it is just so critical that we're having this conversation, and we're doing it, I think, to some large extent through your efforts at NWELL to have these kinds of conversations, to encourage these conversations around dining room tables and not just in the waiting room of intensive care units. So thank you very much for all that you've been doing.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think the more that everybody is talking about this issue, this is on all of us to be a part of this movement. So I'm just thrilled to be able to talk about it with you. Great.
Well, you've mentioned that the documentary is available on Netflix, but for people who are listening that want to learn more about NWELL, where should they look for more information?
Our website is www.endwellproject.org. And we're on just about every social media channel. If you feel like Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, we're everywhere. And our annual symposium is December 5th, based in San Francisco.
That's great. Shoshana, thank you so much for being a part of the Discovery Pod, and thank you for all the work that you do.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Discovery Pod. Be sure to tune in next week for another inspiring and informative conversation. Don't forget to visit our website, thediscoverygroup.ca, for more resources. If you like what you just listened to, please subscribe and tell a friend about it. Until next time, keep working to make your organization exceptional.